The quorum being present, the Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. Committee's meeting today for consideration of H.R. 4408, the National Strategy to Combat Terrorist Travel Act of 2016, H.R. 4407, the Counterterrorism Advisory Board Act of 2016, H.R. 4403, the Enhancing Overseas Traveler Vetting Act, H.R. 4383, the DHS Human Trafficking Prevention Act, H.R. 4402, the Foreign Fighter Review Act, H.R. 4401, the Amplifying Local Efforts to Root Out Terror Act, H.R. 4404, the Terrorist and Foreign Fighter Travel Exercise Act, and H.R. 4398, the DHS Acquisition Documentation Integrity Act. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Almost a year ago, this committee formed a bipartisan task force to look at the rising terrorist and foreign fighter threat. Their mandate was to identify security gaps and provide recommendations, especially to keep terrorists from infiltrating our country. This past September, the task force issued its final report, which was happy to release with Ranking Member Thompson, and which we submitted to the President. I'd like to commend all that who participated in this task force, both on the Republican side, its leader, Mr. Katko, as well as Mr. Loudermilk, Ratcliffe, Hurd, McSally, and all the Democrat colleagues for all their good support on this as well. That report contained more than 50 recommendations to protect the homeland. The review ended up being the widest examination of our defenses against terrorist travel since the 9/11 Commission. The task force concluded that despite concerted efforts to stem the flow, we have largely failed to stop Americans from traveling overseas to join jihadists. This is deeply troubling. U.S. citizens lured to terrorist safe havens represent a triple threat. They strengthen extremist groups on the ground, become their leading recruiters and plotters, and can return home to conduct acts of terror. The task force also found gaping security weaknesses overseas, especially in Europe, which makes it easier for individuals to migrate to terrorist hotspots and eventually return home. Sadly, in the months since the report was released, we see many of its dire warnings come to fruition. In fact, ISIS's global terror campaign in 2015 resulted in the deadliest Islamist terror attacks in America since 9/11 and in Europe since 2004. This committee will not stand on the sidelines while the terror threat surges. We've acted legislatively in some form on nearly half of the task force recommendations, including those we will consider here today. Several of these recommendations were signed into law in December, enhancing the security of the visa waiver program. I have no doubt these new measures will result in the interception of terror suspects and will keep dangerous individuals from reaching our country. I do have serious concerns that the President is not faithfully implementing this law, however. He's decided to interpret it in a way that weakens certain provisions in order to appease state sponsors of terror like Iran. In my view, this is unacceptable. We'll work with House leaders to hold the White House responsible for violating the spirit of the law and potentially putting our nation at risk. Today, though, we have more opportunities to strengthen our security. 6 of the 8 bills we are marking up are products of the task force. Among other measures, these bipartisan bills require the President to produce a national strategy to combat foreign terrorist travel and to act on it, to conduct a full-scale review of attempts by Americans to join jihadists in Syria and Iraq, to enhance state and local efforts to identify terror threats, and to quickly deploy innovative screening tools to help our allies catch terrorists. And in the coming months, we will turn more of the task force's ideas into meaningful legislation. Again, I want to thank the ranking member for all of his work in a bipartisan fashion. As I've said before, we are at war. Our own city streets have become the front lines, which is why I urge my colleagues to act decisively on this legislation. And I must say, after this report came out, the majority leader and the speaker talked to me about how prescient this report was, how we identified the threats and security gaps, and how useful it would be in developing legislation in response to what we saw in both the tragedy in the Paris attacks and in Ms. Torres's district in San Bernardino. I'm proud of the work of this committee in this regard, and with that, I recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, today we will consider 8 measures that continue this committee's record of advancing legislation in areas where there is strong bipartisan agreement. We all have an interest in seeing DHS's hands strengthened when it comes to addressing the complex and consequential challenges posed by terrorist and foreign fighter travel, human trafficking, and acquisition. At the outset, I want to commend the members of the committee's task force on combating terrorist and foreign fighter travel. They delivered a report that set forth a roadmap for improving our ability to prevent terrorists and individuals who have battlefield experience from Syria or Iraq from traveling to the U.S. and carrying out attacks. This bipartisan group, led by Representatives Katko and Sanchez, took on the painstaking process of identifying actions that could be taken by DHS and across the federal government. I want to express my appreciation for the efforts of the Democratic members of the task force, Representatives Sanchez, Vila, and Payne. I'd also like to acknowledge the contributions of Nicole Tisdale on my staff to this bipartisan effort. I'm pleased that today we will be considering 6 measures that flows from the task force recommendations with respect to this multidimensional, multifaceted Homeland Security challenge. I'm also pleased that this committee will be considering timely legislation that Representative Sanchez introduced with Representative McSally to bolster the effectiveness of the department's Blue Campaign against human smuggling. On this issue of human smuggling in particular, Representative Sanchez is a leader on this panel. Her common sense bill seeks to break down the silos within DHS that undermines its ability to identify and investigate human smuggling rings. January was Human Trafficking Awareness Month, an opportunity to redouble our efforts to identify and prevent these crimes. Enactment of H.R. 4383, the Human Trafficking Prevention Act of 2016, is a spirit of such efforts and holds the promise of saving lives. The final bill that I'd like to highlight today was introduced by Representative Watson Coleman. The DHS Acquisition Documentation Integrity Act of 2016 seeks to ensure that the fundamentals are in place at DHS when it comes to acquisition documentation. The maintenance of accurate and timely information about cost estimates and schedules is no minor matter, particularly for major acquisition programs, those programs with life cycle cost estimates of $300 million or greater. Yet DHS has a checkered record when it comes to holding its components' feet to the fire. Ms. Watson-Coleman's legislation, which was incorporated into H.R. 3572, the DHS headquarters bill, would codify component responsibilities with respect to collecting and maintaining acquisition documentation and sets a high bar for when such requirements may be waived. This legislation is timely and important, particularly with DHS operating at sequestered budget levels. Every dollar wasted on a runaway program is a dollar that could have gone to secure the homeland. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the ranking member. Members are reminded opening statements may be submitted for the record. By agreement between the chair and ranking member, the committee, by unanimous consent, shall use an amendment roster today.
Mr. Chairman.
The ranking member is recognized.
Reserving the right to object, and I will not object, would the chair please explain our agreement regarding the amendment roster? And I yield to the chair.
I thank the gentleman and all committee members for agreeing to the use of this roster. We have agreed that the bills be open to amendment at any point, that we shall take up amendments in the order listed on the roster. The chair will allow members to offer amendments listed on the roster out of order to the extent practicable and in a manner not prohibited by House or committee rules. Amendments not listed on the roster may be considered at the conclusion of consideration of the roster. And would the ranking member withdraw his reservation?
Well, I guess there was a couple other
That's what
sentences.
my script says.
Okay, all right. I thank the chair for his explanation and withdraw my reservation.
I thank the ranking member. I now call up H.R. 4408, the National Strategy to Combat Terrorist Travel Act of 2016. Bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 4408.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open. To amendment, the chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've spent the better part of the past year focused on stopping terrorists from infiltrating our country and keeping Americans from being lured to fight in terrorist safe havens overseas. As the head of the bipartisan task force on combating terrorist and foreign fighter travel, I work closely with my colleagues to identify our top security vulnerabilities and to close them quickly. Last September, we completed the most extensive public review since the 9/11 Commission of U.S. efforts to fight terrorist travel, and we issued more than 50 recommendations. I'm proud to say that as of today, we have acted on almost half of them, including with the introduction of this bill and the others to follow. The legislation before us would implement one of our top recommendations. It would require the President to send Congress a national strategy to combat terrorist travel and an actionable plan to implement it. It has been a decade since we had such a strategy, and since then, the threat has changed dramatically in this country. In fact, today in Syria and Iraq, we are witnessing the largest convergence of Islamist terrorists in history. Reports indicate more than 35,000 individuals from 120-plus countries have traveled there to join the movement, including thousands from Western countries like the United States. Already, many of these foreign fighters have been dispatched by ISIS to conduct acts of terror elsewhere. We saw that in Paris, and we've already seen American foreign fighters return home prepared to strike. This is a new era in an evolving struggle, but our task force was stunned to find the government lagging so far behind the threat in certain areas. Indeed, many of the counterterrorism programs we created after 9/11 are operating without clear strategic guidance and are not adequately coordinated across federal agencies. The result is that not only are we at greater risk that terrorists will slip through the cracks, but we also risk greater government waste, overlap, and duplication. This bill would force administration, for the first time ever, to assess all of our efforts in place to stop terrorists from crossing borders, to streamline them, to identify security gaps, and to prioritize taxpayer dollars where they are needed most. It is crucial that we spot our vulnerabilities before jihadists do first, and that is why we need this legislation. ISIS has been linked to nearly 75 plots or attacks against Western countries, including 20 against the U.S. homeland. As political leaders, we owe it to our constituents to take every measure possible to defend this country and the freedoms our adversaries want to destroy. This bill continues our committee's efforts to do just that. I want to express how encouraged I am by the bipartisan manner of this task force, which is really kind of a hallmark of the entire Homeland Security Committee. And on this bill, I am grateful for their collaboration with Mr. Keating, Mr. Payne, and Ms. Sanchez. I would like to especially thank Representative Vela for his continued support and significant contributions. And I also appreciate, Mr. Chairman, you allowing myself and the other freshmen here to lead the task force and for your leadership on this issue, so thank you. And I encourage my colleagues to support this measure, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the bill?
Mr.
Ms.
Chairman.
Sanchez is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I would like to thank Mr. Katko. He just mentioned that this was a very bipartisan task force, and it was, and I appreciate that. And this is a threat that I believe we need to get a handle on because it will be coming at us exponentially in the years to come. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we saw. We saw that after 2001, we were focused on a threat from Al-Qaeda, and we really, in a lot of ways, in different jurisdictions, in different ways, haven't moved beyond that. And it is incredibly important for us to move forward. So I in particular would like to thank him, and I would also like to thank the members of the task force for putting in the time and reviewing and being as thoughtful. I mean, there were a lot of discussions that I had on the House floor with many of the members about how and why we could counteract this. So I'm thrilled to be supporting it today.
Yeah, we appreciate your participation. Gentlelady yields back. Is there any further discussion? Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to also thank Representative Katko for this legislation, and I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor with him on this. I believe the bill provides key measures to prevent foreign fighters from traveling to the United States and strengthens our current strategy. Last year, I had the opportunity to travel overseas with my colleagues on this committee, including my colleague from New York, to speak with various stakeholders, foreign intelligence agencies, and our international partners on the importance of countering terrorist travel. Following this trip, I was joined by the chairman of this committee and other members in successfully offering an amendment to the intelligence authorization that will help Congress identify ways to improve intelligence sharing on the flow of foreign fighters around the world, with particular attention to their travel to and from Iraq and Syria. Since this effort, we witnessed the tragic, calculated attack in Paris on November, and we saw firsthand the heinous plots that were planned and perpetrated across borders with ease. Over 20,000 foreign fighters have traveled to join rebel and terrorist groups in Iraq and Syria, including ISIL and al-Qaeda affiliates like al-Nusra. Their movements are proving increasingly difficult to track in our globalized world, particularly given the uneven and non-existent trafficking efforts from our foreign partners. This bill will ensure that our resources are best allocated to the design and implementation of a comprehensive strategy, and I encourage all our colleagues to support it. Again, thank the gentleman from New York. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion on the bill, the committee will move to consideration of the amendments. There are no amendments listed on the roster. Are there any amendments to the bill? If not, the question now occurs on agreeing to the bill, H.R. 4408. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. Question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 4408 to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion, would you like to retract that? It's your bill.
Did you mean that?
Do you want it to go to the floor or not?
Are you debating?
Well,
are you debating yourself?
The gentleman's overruled. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. I hope that didn't appear on C-SPAN.
It did.
I now call up H.R. 4407, the Counterterrorism Advisory Board Act of 2016. Bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 4407.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, for 5 minutes.
Does anyone notice my recent suntan here? So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As many of my colleagues can attest, the government sometimes fails to communicate even with the same department. In order to ensure the Department of Homeland Security collaborates to fight against terrorism, I've introduced a Counterterrorism Advisory Board, or CTAB Act. This bill firmly establishes the CTAB in law and makes the board the department's central coordination body for counterterrorism activities. While DHS has been bringing together the department's top officials to coordinate such activities for years, our task force found that the CTABs had not been codified and its charter had not been kept pace with today's evolving threats. By codifying this panel of senior DHS decision makers, Congress can ensure DHS effectively integrates intelligence, operations, and policy to combat terrorism and quickly exchanges threat information. Furthermore, by increasing counterterrorism coordination, this bill will help reduce waste and duplication and will make sure threat mitigation efforts are carried out efficiently. Codification also ensures compliance with Secretary Johnson's unity of effort guidance and other best practices currently being implemented by DHS. These recommendations were explicitly stated in our bipartisan report released last year. I would like to conclude by thanking the other members of the task force again for their continued support and for working across the aisle. With the markup of 6 task force bills today, we will have acted legislatively on almost half of the task force's recommendations, and in doing so, work towards making this country safer. Again, I ask my colleagues' support for this bipartisan, common sense legislation and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion of the bill, the committee will move to consideration of the amendments. There are no amendments listed on the roster. Are there any amendments to the bill? If not, the question now occurs on agreeing to the bill, H.R. 4407. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. Question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 4407 to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table, and staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. I now call up H.R. 4403, the Enhancing Overseas Traveler Vetting Act. The bill was circulated in advance, and printed copies are available. Clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 4403.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hurd, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In May 2006, the National Counterterrorism Center's National Strategy to Combat Terrorist Travel linked our foreign partners' abilities to combat terrorist travel to our own national security. However, not enough action was taken following this document's release to enhance our foreign partners' vetting capabilities or to assess the weaknesses in their vetting systems. So it shouldn't be surprising that one of this past September's Foreign Fighter Task Force report's key findings was that our European partners do not have a robust enough process to vet individuals traveling across their borders, or the hundreds of thousands of migrants arriving at their borders. This is a vulnerability ISIS has exploited. The purpose of this bill is to help our foreign partners strengthen their processes of vetting travelers who come in and out of their country and to ensure that they do not pose any threat. U.S. agencies have the software that helps determine whether a person wishing to enter the homeland could pose a threat or not. It is important that our foreign partners have access to some of these effective systems so they can also be implemented abroad. We have a history of doing this. For instance, Pisces were provided to Pakistan, Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan, and 16 other countries. This is software that allows border patrols to more easily document people who have crossed borders, and they can track individuals of interest and identify potential threats. However, some countries have refused to accept U.S.-made systems out of the fear that the code for our systems, which is otherwise not disclosed to that country, could compromise their intelligence and security systems. This bill addresses this problem by authorizing the Secretary of Homeland Security and the Secretary of State to make certain versions of software the U.S. uses to vet travelers coming to and from the United States open source. Making a system open source means making its software code open and available. This effectively mitigates the concerns of countries who would otherwise refuse the U.S. systems without access to the software code. The changes this legislation puts forth sets the stage for actions that are critical to our national security. It is imperative we incentivize our foreign partners to be proactive about their vetting systems of travelers and migrants. This is exactly the kind of thing this bill seeks to achieve. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion, the committee will move to consideration of the amendments on the roster. Listed first is an amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee. Would the gentlewoman like to offer her amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4403, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Ms. Jackson Lee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. First of all, let me compliment the author of the bill, thank him for his expertise and leadership on this issue, and let me thank the task force as well on terrorism, Mr. Katko, Ms. Sanchez, and our chairman and ranking member. As a ranking member on the Crime and Terrorism Committee on Judiciary, I can see the importance of our overlap on these very, how should I say, current and ongoing issues that we are seeing every single day. And so my amendment adds to this bipartisan bill intended to develop software that could be used by other nations in creating terrorist screening databases. The Jackson Lee Amendment to H.R. 4403 assures that open software developed as a consequence of this bill will be done in a manner consistent with cybersecurity best practices. It is clear that the cybersecurity aspect of our responsibilities is one that has the attention not only of this nation, our states, our businesses, but also internationally. This amendment ensures that the best knowledge on how to develop secure software is used to create open source software applications intended to aid other nations in developing terrorist screening databases to make all of us safe. Software vulnerabilities are used by those seeking to do harm to computer networks or steal information, which could include terrorists, and we could call the roll on the incidences that impacted the United States. We must assure that any application intended to identify terrorists that are developed by foreign governments are free of vulnerabilities that could be exploited by terrorists or thieves. I ask the committee to support the Jackson Lee Amendment, and I thank again the committee and the author of this legislation. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Ms. Jackson Lee. The chair is supportive. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to.
Thank you.
There are no additional amendments listed on the roster. Are there any further amendments to the bill? There being no further amendments, the question now occurs on agreeing to the bill H.R. 4403 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. Question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 4403 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table, and staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. I now call up H.R. 4383, the DHS Human Trafficking Prevention Act of 2016. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Border and Maritime Security is discharged from further consideration. Bill was circulated in advance. Printed copies are available. Clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 4383.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Listed first on the roster is an amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Sanchez. Does the gentlewoman wish to offer her amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have the amendment at the desk.
And the clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4383, offered by Ms. Sanchez.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered base text for purposes of amendment. The amendment in nature of substitute was noticed to committee members in compliance with the rules. Chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Sanchez, for 5 minutes. I'm trying to get through this as fast as I
Thank you,
can.
Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you, and I want to thank Ranking Member Thompson for considering this bill and bringing it forward in an expedient manner. As a long-serving member of the Congressional Caucus on Human Rights and on human trafficking, I strongly support efforts by our federal government, local law enforcement, and community partners to combat human trafficking. Each year, there's almost 18,000 innocent people who are trafficked into the United States. About half of those are individuals, are children. And the mission of the Department of Homeland Security's Blue Campaign is to unify DHS components and community partners in tackling this human trafficking problem by raising public awareness, training law enforcement, and detecting and investigating possible cases, protecting and aiding the victims, and bringing suspected traffickers to justice. However, just this past January, the Department of Homeland Security Office of the Inspector General released a report that found, as sometimes is the case in government, that two pieces of the government within Department of Homeland Security weren't really speaking and using their work together. Because of this, traffickers have exploited our work and our fiancé visa programs to bring victims into the United States. And this was possible, again, because there were some gaps, and I believe these gaps have resulted in far too many human trafficking victims slipping through the cracks. And so I introduced H.R. 4383, DHS Human Trafficking Prevention Act of 2016, because it renews our commitment to combat human trafficking, and it has bipartisan support with my colleague, Representative McSally. So today I'm offering an amendment in a nature of a substitute that reflects the bipartisan input we have had since we introduced that bill, and it enhances the bill. And in keeping with the Inspector General's recommendations, my amendment aims to break down the stovepipes within the department to protect our visa programs from exploitation by human trafficking networks, and to make investigation and efforts more effective. The amendment requires the department to issue department-wide guidance on collecting and recording the information needed to identify and track known and alleged traffickers, ensuring that this information is reliable and therefore useful, as well as implementing practices for the systematic and routine sharing of that information between the components of law enforcement. My amendment also requires that the information technology systems used by the DHS components to record and track information on traffickers are integrated in order to facilitate cross-referencing the items. And lastly, the amendment directs the Inspector General to review changes in the department's processes within 18 months of this enactment. It's our responsibility as members of Congress to do whatever it takes to stop this illegal and immoral smuggling of innocent people and children into the U.S. And with that, I ask for my colleagues' support, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. McSally.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank my colleague, Ms. Sanchez, for leading on this issue and opportunity to be a co-lead with her. When I looked at the IG report, I was just infuriated to see that we've got known trafficking networks that are exploiting our legal system to bring human trafficking victims into the United States because of stovepipes and inefficiencies and information flow failures in our federal government. So I'm a proud partner with you on this legislation as a co-lead. Totally support this legislation. Human trafficking is something that is very important to all of us here, and we've got to make sure that we do everything we can in order to stop this scourge of people that are in slavery right now today and using our systems and failures in our systems to exploit that. So this is a great bill, and I'm proud to be working with you on it, and I urge our colleagues to support it. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Any further discussion? Let me just say, we had a field hearing in Houston at Texas Southern University on this very issue, and I want to thank the gentlelady from California for bringing this up. I know it's not ISIS related, but it is, as has been said, it's human slavery, and children are being abused and exploited every day from the traffickers, and I think this is a very good piece of legislation.
Would the gentleman yield?
Chair recognizes Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Thank you for acknowledging the hearing that we had in Houston, and to the gentlelady from California, Chairman is right. Your amendment contributes to, how should I say, the solution to the scourge of human trafficking, which we have come to understand is more profitable than drug trafficking, because those individuals get used over and over again, whether it's for work or whether it's for sexual exploitation. It is a tragedy that is not ending, and it is something that this Congress must embrace continuously until we stomp it out. So I thank you for your amendment. I yield back to the chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Any further discussion? There being no further discussion, the committee will move to consideration of the amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute on the roster. There are no amendments listed on the roster. Does anyone wish to offer an amendment? There being no further amendments, the question now occurs on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4383. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. Thank you for bringing this. The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 4383 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. And staff are authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. I now call up H.R. 4402, the Foreign Fighter Review Act of 2016. The bill is circulated in advance and printed copies are available. Clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 4402.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Bill is considered read and open to amendment. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hurd, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Foreign Fighter Task Force report highlights the threat posed by U.S. citizens and residents who have traveled to war zones to support terrorists and then returned to the homeland. The task force revealed there have been over 250 cases since 2011 of Americans who have attempted to travel or succeeded in traveling to Syria or Iraq in order to support terrorist groups operating in those areas. It's likely the number is much higher now since more time has passed since the task force conducted its review. It is essential that law enforcement take every measure to catch these individuals who subsequently attempt to return to the homeland. This bill would require the Department of Homeland Security to undertake a study of all the known incidents where a person has traveled or attempted to travel from the United States to Syria or Iraq to support a terrorist organization and submit those findings to Congress. The study will identify the challenges law enforcement faces in their attempts to stop individuals from joining terrorist organizations in Iraq and Syria. Undertaking a study of this type is the first step in shedding light on specific areas of weakness within our Homeland Security apparatus. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion of the bill, Ms. Sanchez is recognized.
I just had a question for the author. Mr. Hurd, I noticed that on page 2 of your bill, it says Iraq or Syria or other terrorist safe havens abroad. This is in the study area, you know, the study that you're doing to take a look. Would it just include Iraq and Syria, or could it? I mean, there's so many places now where we see this going on. My question is just, were you really trying to limit it just to Syria and Iraq at this point?
Look, I think the original intent is to follow up on the Foreign Fighter Task Force, which we participated on, and the focus had been Iraq and Syria. But I don't see why this shouldn't extend to other locations, because this is a problem around the world. Yemen,
And that's the way I view it, as you know.
Libya is becoming an issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted a little bit of clarification.
Sure. So I think to make it clear, for clarification, the congressional intent is to include both Iraq and Syria, but also terrorist safe havens abroad. Any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion on the bill, the committee will move to consideration of the amendments on the roster. Listed first is an amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee. Would the gentlewoman like to offer her amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4402, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee.
The objection to reading is dispensed with. Ms. Jackson Lee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Again, thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, Task Force, and to Mr. Hurd for this amendment. This comes at a time when foreign fighters are prominent in the tragedies that they have created and the idea of going to the caliphate to fight. This bill focuses on the Foreign Fighter Review Act, and it requires a review of information regarding persons who have traveled or attempted to travel from the United States to support terrorist organizations in Syria and Iraq and for other purposes. I heard the question of Ms. Sanchez, and although the focus is there, we know that in the fiancé visa San Bernardino scenario, the individual or the fiancé was traveling through Saudi Arabia. So we know that this is a beginning process of looking at this broadly, but I support the underlying legislation. The Jackson Lee Amendment makes sure that the report already required by the bill would include information on travel routes of greatest concern to our nation's homeland security. And so we realize that as we may travel from New York and stop in Chicago, may visit Texas and wind up in Los Angeles, that may be the same scenario that occurs in the instance of a foreign fighter's travel. The Jackson Lee, in terms of other nations, but their points of departure are both Iraq and Syria. The Jackson Lee Amendment creates a focus for the report on how foreign fighters are entering and leaving the conflict zones in Iraq and Syria. I also thank the bipartisan support of the Homeland Security staff in working with my staff on the amendments I offer today. In addition, I appreciate the support for Jackson Lee report language, which will guide implementation of H.R. 4402, the Foreign Fighter Review Act, should it become law. The Jackson Lee report language would direct that the report analyze changes in routes used by foreign fighters entering and leaving the Iraq and Syrian conflict zones to consider the efforts by the United States and allied nations to stop the flow of foreign fighters coming to do us harm. The goal of this report language is to better understand how foreign fighters attempt to counteract efforts to stop the flow of foreign fighters to the conflict area. This report language will aid the United States in determining how efforts to stop foreign fighters from traveling to Iraq and Syria are succeeding or impacting the travel routes of fighters. It's my hope that this will allow better analytics on foreign fighter travel to Syria and Iraq with the goal of improving the effectiveness of actions taken by the United States and allies to stop or decrease foreign fighter access to Iraq and Syria. With that, I ask my colleagues to support the Jackson-Lee amendment, support the underlying bill, and yield back.
Generally yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Ms. Jackson-Lee. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. There are no additional amendments listed on the roster. Are there any further amendments to the bill? There being no further amendments, the question now occurs on agreeing to the bill H.R. 4402 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. Question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 4402 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table, and the staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. I now call up H.R. 4401, the Amplifying Local Efforts to Root Out Terror Act of 2016. Bill was circulated in advance, and printed copies are available. Clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 4401.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Bill is considered read and open to amendment. At any point, Chair now recognizes a gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. State and local law enforcement agencies are too often overlooked as an asset to fighting against acts of terrorism. However, when properly trained and informed, they become an important element of our national security, as well as a force multiplier for our federal agencies. For this reason, I have introduced this bill, Amplifying Local Efforts to Root Out Terrorism, or the ALERT Act of 2016. This bill, if passed, will boost training of state and local law enforcement officials and increase community awareness of the foreign fighter threat. I've seen from my time working in the intelligence community to legislating at the state level to conducting law enforcement roundtables in my district this past year that fighting terrorism is not a singular effort conducted by one element of our federal government, but it requires the cooperation and coordination of multiple levels of all governments. My bill authorizes the Department of Homeland Security through the Fusion Centers to educate and train state and local law enforcement officials on the best tactics and methods used to identify terrorist threats in our communities, effectively identify and report suspicious activities, as well as methods to counter violent extremism. We cannot effectively stop acts of terror if there is a broken relationship between federal and local law enforcement, or if there are gaps in communicating potential threats or suspicious activities, both up and down the chain. Through this legislation, we intend to help the federal and local police work in sync to keep our communities safer. Also, by passing the ALERT Act, DHS will be required to provide an assessment of their counterterrorism efforts so we, as members of Congress, can assess the progress they're making. Furthermore, the department will report to Congress on the number of security clearances it has granted to state and local law enforcement so we can close any and all security gaps within our law enforcement communities. I think I speak for all of us when we say we want to see a safe, protected nation that is shielded from those who seek to do us harm and who chant death to America. It isn't a partisan issue, it's a safety issue. This legislation will not in itself end the threat of terrorism against our nation, but it will add a critical resource that is already in our communities, our local law enforcement. Thank you for your consideration on this bill, and I now yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion, the committee will move to consideration of the amendments. There are no amendments listed on the roster. Are there any amendments to the bill? If not, the question now occurs on agreeing to the bill, H.R. 4401. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. Question now occurs on reporting the bill, H.R. 4401, to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. I now call up H.R. 4404, the Terrorist and Foreign Fighter Travel Exercise Act of 2016. Bill was circulated in advance. Printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 4404.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Arizona, Ms. McSally, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And since we got started late for votes, in the interest of time, I ask unanimous consent that my written statement be submitted for the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And let me just say, this is simply directing the Department of Homeland Security to conduct a national exercise related to the flow of foreign fighters. The last exercise was in 2009 and did not really reflect the new scope of the metastasizing threat. So this bill just specifically directs them to have a national exercise, and I urge everybody to support this bill. And I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion, the committee will move to consideration of the amendments on the roster. Listed first is an amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne. Would the gentleman like to offer his amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4404, offered by Mr. Payne.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Mr. Payne is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin, I'd like to congratulate the Emergency Preparedness Subcommittee Chair, Ms. McSally, on her efforts to ensure that the federal government acts quickly to test its capabilities to respond to emerging threats posed by foreign fighters. It is important that the federal government, together with its state, local, and private sector partners, conduct exercises that challenge the existing capabilities to identify gaps in responding to new threats. That is why I am an original co-sponsor of the Terrorist and Foreign Fighter Travel Exercise Act. My amendment would build upon the bill's requirement that the department conduct a one-time exercise to test our ability to respond to threats posed by terrorists and foreign fighters. Specifically, my amendment requires that the national exercise program include, to the extent practical, scenarios involving the threat posed by foreign fighters. This will give the participants in the exercise required under this act an opportunity to test and validate corrective actions implemented to address lessons learned. I encourage the committee to support my amendment, and once again, I congratulate the subcommittee chairman on her bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Payne. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. There are no additional amendments on the roster. Are there any further amendments to the bill? There being no further amendments, the question now occurs on agreeing to the bill, H.R. 4404, as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. Question now occurs on reporting the bill, H.R. 4404, as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table, and staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. I now call up H.R. 4398, the DHS Acquisition Documentation Integrity Act of 2016. Bill was circulated in advance, and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 4398.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Bill is considered read and open to amendment. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from New Jersey, Ms. Watson Coleman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to present this bill, which is focused on making sure the DHS follows acquisition best practices. In fiscal year 2015, the department planned to spend roughly $11 billion on major acquisition programs, those programs with life cycle cost estimates in excess of $300 million. That $11 billion represents about 1/6 of the department's total budget. The department's challenges with respect to managing acquisitions are well known. In fact, a 2015 review by the Comptroller General found that 14 of 22 major acquisition programs at the DHS suffered cost or schedule overruns, and that 3/4 of the remaining programs lacked valid documentation against which to assess their performance. This past April, in a hearing in my subcommittee, we heard that requirements for critical documents used to report to Congress have been waived by the Department for 25 of the 72 major acquisition programs. Given the Department's checkered record on acquisitions, I was dumbfounded to learn that about 35% of the highest risk, costliest, and most important DHS acquisitions were let off the hook to provide documentation essential to effective acquisition management. The bill that we are marking up today, the DHS Acquisition Documentation Integrity Act of 2016, is based on an amendment I offered to the DHS Headquarters Reform and Improvement Act, H.R. 3572, which the committee adopted unanimously last year. It requires all DHS components to maintain complete, accurate, timely, and valid documentation for each major acquisition program, such as the life cycle cost estimates and a comprehensive schedule. Moreover, my bill requires that cost estimates and schedules for major DHS acquisition programs be consistent with best practices as identified by GAO, and requires that certain acquisition documentation be submitted by components for the production of an annual comprehensive DHS report to Congress on the status of these acquisitions. Significantly, the bill limits the Secretary's authority to waive requirements that components contribute to this annual report by setting forth narrow conditions for waivers. In the event that waivers are issued in the future, the bill requires DHS to provide Congress with information about the programs granted such waivers. Mr. Chairman, anything less than complete, accurate, and up-to-date acquisition documentation increases the risk of costs and schedule overruns, delays in the delivery of capabilities needed by the Department to perform critical missions, and a depletion of resources needed to address future requirements. And to help DHS address these long-standing challenges in acquisition management, I urge the approval of this bill based on legislation that's already passed both this committee and the House. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
The gentlewoman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion, the committee will move to consideration of the amendments. There are no amendments listed on the roster. Are there any amendments to the bill? Question now occurs on agreeing to the bill H.R. 4398. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the bill is agreed to. Question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 4398 to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table, and staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. This concludes our consideration of the bills noticed by the committee for today. And before I recognize Mr. Marino, I just want to thank all of those who served on this task force. This will now mean that half of our recommendations have now been moved through this committee in legislation. This task force was designed to identify security gaps to further protect the American people. That's what this committee is all about, and I believe that this legislation and the work of this task force will greatly improve the safety of the American people. With that, I now recognize Mr. Marino.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to Rule 22, Clause 1 of the Rules of the House, I move that the committee authorize the chairman to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the bills ordered reported by this committee today or on similar Senate bills. I yield back.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking member is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I ask that members have 2 calendar days to file with the clerk of the committee supplemental, additional, or minority views on each of the bills ordered reported by the committee today.
Without objection, so ordered. And we, again, express my appreciation to all the authors of this legislation, and many of whom are freshmen on this committee and have done an outstanding job representing the American people. There being no further business to transact.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Payne is recognized.
Thank you, sir. I want to just thank the committee for the work that they've done with reference to these issues, but I have not had the opportunity to speak to my ranking member about it, but I'm interested in also exploring the issues around Boko Haram, which have not been brought up in these matters. They are wreaking havoc in countries in Africa as ISIL has joined forces with ISIL. And I think that that is something that we should explore, because instability anywhere, you know, we had a big discussions around what happened in Paris. These people are being murdered, Christians in Nigeria and Muslims that don't agree with Boko Haram are being murdered every week, and there is no discussion about it. So I hope at some point when we have the time, we can explore that issue as well. And I yield back.
I see the ranking member is recognized.
Yeah, we early on had a hearing. It might have been last session or something. Not since you've been on the committee, but you're absolutely correct. It's something that is escalating in that part of Africa that is put a different twist on terrorism, but nonetheless, it fits the modus operandi of terrorists, and however it looks, we need to move forward with it. So I support the gentleman.
And with your leadership,
Oh, yeah.
Mr. Member, we can discuss further.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we had a report on Boko Haram. Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Mr. Chairman, and I thank my colleagues for their indulgence. Let me thank the gentleman from New Jersey and the ranking member, and I know the chairman did have a matter. They are developing their own territory. They are going outside of boundaries, and they are now moving from Chad to Cameroon to Nigeria. They are burning mosques and churches and schools. The Chibok girls, which I know that many of you wore and read on Wednesday, are still not found. And one of the most heinous things, whenever you think of burning children alive in the last 48 hours, which I think has provoked you, Mr. Payne, pouring gasoline on children. So, and I think the point that is being made, we would be concerned for foreign fighters going there or having individuals that may have been in that area coming to the United States. So I think it is directly related. I know you'd be interested, Mr. Chairman, maybe we can find a way to work on those matters. I yield back.
General's point as well, recognizing, as is Mr. Payne, I will work with you to hold a hearing on that issue. I think as I very concerned, I mean, your father and I co-chaired the Sudan caucus. I know this is outside of there, but it's in the continent. With Boko Haram's allegiance to ISIS, with the kidnapping of 250 schoolgirls and persecution of Christians as well, I think, unfortunately, in this business, there's no shortage of issues. But I do believe that is a ripe issue for us to hold a hearing on. So I look forward to working with you on that. And Ms. Sanchez is recognized.
I would just like to say, I get to sit on I sit on the Armed Services Committee, as you know, and we have AFRICOM, and I haven't seen it lately, but they have a really good briefing on this particular issue. It might be nice to have a briefing before we hold a hearing so that we have, maybe in a closed session, so that we have more of a real feel for what we're seeing on the ground there. Right, but maybe a briefing for the members first, and then it could really push the direction of where we would want a hearing in public.
I think it's an excellent idea. I've met with AFRICOM and CENTCOM. I think that's an ideal briefing or primer, if you will, before a hearing, to hold a classified briefing in the SCIF by AFRICOM, and then hold either subcommittee or full committee hearing on the issue. I think it's certainly would get attention, and it's an important issue that, as I mentioned, there are just so many threats now. It's hard to cover them all, but I want to thank the gentleman for bringing this one up, because I think it's very important. So with that, there being no further business, the committee stands adjourned.